The Lumina Foundation was created in 2001 and is located in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a building constructed in 1929 by L.S. Ayers, a large department store. Ayers' famous tea room was located on the 8th floor. Today, Lumina's offices are located on the 7th and 8th floors. The building itself is a historical landmark, with mail chutes reminiscent of an earlier age. Thanks to Terry St. John, my path through the Lumina Foundation was well guided. Entering the door, I found an interactive display in which a university student, Gabriel, provides enlightenment about the efficacy of community colleges, disputing antiquated notions. It already felt like home. Jamie Marasotis is the president of Lumina. I met Lucia Anderson. This name may be familiar to those of you who subscribe to the daily compilation of higher education news through Lumina. Dave Powell is the senior editor and speechwriter. Among other things, Dave edits Lumina's seasonal publication, Focus, and A Stronger Nation Through Higher Education. These publications are available at lumina.org. Lumina has recently released their 2013-16 strategic plan, Goal 2025, which focuses on mobilization as well as designing and building a 21st century higher education system. The emphasis on that goal will be clear in the following meetings with James Applegate, the Vice President for Strategic Impact, Dwayne Matthews, the Vice President for Policy and Strategy, Elizabeth Gutierrez, the Director of State Policy, and Sam Cargile, the Vice President and Senior Advisor to the CEO. Sam is also one of the original architects for achieving the dream. Let's listen to what these professionals have to say about the Lumina Foundation, community colleges, leadership, and working with students of promise.
Well, we're the largest foundation in the United States solely focused on college access and success. That's all we do. Our mission has never changed. The foundation was formed in 2000, so we're a relatively young foundation, but I think and I say this having been here 5 years, so I wasn't here for the first 8, although I was a Lumina grantee, so I'm not taking credit for this, but I think they did quite an amazing job of building their brand and their credibility in the higher ed space over that period. Early in the foundation's history, I think that as a new foundation, it was a very mission-driven foundation in the respect that we funded things that were consistent with our mission, which was to increase college access and success for low-income, first-generation students of color, and adults got added in there pretty quickly because of just the necessity of that. The grant making, all the work we were doing was largely what I would call responsive grant making. That is, we waited for people to send us good ideas, and then we would evaluate it if it seemed to fit the mission, if it looked like it could produce outcomes, reasonable outcomes, good people, etc. Good, strong, competitive criteria. But we funded it, and again, it was responsive. In 2007, the board adopted Goal 2025, which is the commitment to try to, it's not Lumina's goal, we hope it is becoming the country's goal, which is to move from where we've sort of been stuck for decades, which is around 40% of our adult workforce with some form of post-secondary 2-year, 4-year degree, to 60% by 2025, and that is the goal. And that number 60% was not like throw a dart at a wall. And we've actually reinforced it with a lot more work since we adopted the goal. A big part of the role we think we need to play is around mobilization. In so many areas of this work, we know what needs to be done to be game-changing. We just can't seem to get enough people to, as Shakespeare would say, screw their courage to the sticking place and do it. That applies to higher ed systems, that applies to policymakers at the federal and state level, that applies to regions and cities. We have these islands of excellence all over the country. We have higher ed institutions who have, over a 5-year period with a concerted effort, who had significant opportunity gaps for low-income and minority students, eliminate them. And they're identified in a report called Advancing to Completion, put out by the Education Trust. We fund a program with them called Access to Success. But yet they remain, these isolated places. There's no prairie fire that seems to be, you'd think if once everybody understood that Towson University and Virginia Commonwealth and Florida State and all these institutions had done it, they'd all be flocking there to say, how did you do it? Come help us figure out how to do it. Not happening. So our goal, I think, and that's just one example, but our goal is to be an influence to mobilizing that work so it does begin to scale and sustain across large systems. We work with SUNY. We work with all these different large higher education systems around the country. But that's just one dimension. We're working with metropolitan regions. We think there's a lot of progress to be gained with our cities. And it's not that we don't care about rural areas, not that we wouldn't help one if it came and asked for help in some way, but it's sort of like when they asked one of the famous bank robbers, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. Well, why do we want to work with metropolitan regions? That's where the people are. And the people we most want to serve, the fast-growing Latino populations, the African-American population, students of color, adults, low-income folk. So I think Lumina is really, because I guess the last thing I say about what Lumina is about is it is about being a voice for the voiceless. Because, and if you look at our goal and you look at what it will take to get to our goal, the only way we get there is through providing post-secondary opportunity and success for those people we have done the worst job providing it to for decades. Because if you look at the census in 2010, among 24-year-olds, which is post-traditional college, in the upper income quartile, 4 out of 5 have a 4-year college degree. We do a great job educating wealthy people in this country. We really do. I mean, if you're born to a wealthy family, to not get a college degree, you have to do something to stop yourself. You have to jump off the boat, tie a rock around your ankle, and drown yourself. Whereas if you look at the lowest income quartile, it's 1 out of 10. And of course, the tragedy of that is not only for the individual who have left out the college mix as an economic disaster for them. The tragedy of that is we're in a talent war with the rest of the world to drive our economy, etc. And when you think about those 9 out of 10 low-income students who we threw off the college boat or never even let them get on, you wonder about, lives that weren't saved by one of them who would become a doctor, or diseases that weren't cured, or businesses that went out of business because they couldn't find the skilled workforce they need to stay in business, or they had to offshore. Or you look at the current situation with low-educated states, where they're just crumbling under the massive burden of huge criminal justice, public assistance, Medicaid, healthcare costs that largely go away when you have an educated population.
I think they view them as, again, engines of the economy. That's kind of the term they've always used for themselves. I'm a former community college trustee, and I know that we've always thought, well, we're much more able to respond to not only local and national needs, but student needs, be all things to all students. Well, we're finding out that's not necessarily the best way to achieve higher completion numbers, not just rates, but numbers. So community colleges need to rethink their focus too, and not just try to be broadly all things to all people, but to narrow that and focus that and help students do the same. Understand why you're here, what the options are, how you can more quickly get through, for example, the remediation sequence of courses, get to credit bearing, maybe have several goals along the way that will translate into workforce credentials that they can continue to pursue. So I think it's going to rock the world of community colleges too. It really is, even as we speak.
Right.
We have been focusing a lot on developmental education recently, not only because there's so much research being done on it, but also so much discussion of it as we now aim to educate all populations, including those that American higher ed never really took too seriously in the past. First-generation college students, returning adults, Latino and African American students in much larger numbers. And we know that that's where the bulk of the remediation students are in, the large numbers are in community colleges in particular. So a lot of the research is showing, and the practice is showing in community colleges, that what works best is an accelerated sequence of courses, including some that are woven into the general ed core or the entry level courses that are credit bearing, and then having those very closely connected to students, to their own academic goals, have them integrated into their academic plans so that it includes financial aid. They can count on, in terms of time as well as degree or credential, what that's going to be. So it's not just an endless process. So they can be, again, very focused from the minute they arrive, and they will not be, that their expectations are properly set and that the supports are there. So we just had a convening this week on the latest practice in remedial education, and it was conducted by Complete College America, and much of their research shows that students do much better when they're put in predictable developmental ed sequences, cohort-based, very much, you know all of the best practices around developmental ed, directed pathways, not a lot of options, and that they are, to the extent possible, full-time or closer to full-time, so that they quickly get through an accelerated sequence of dev ed in both English and math.
So we've done a lot of work on, improving practice in developmental education, and it includes, in addition to stuff Liz was talking about, the integration of developmental education into credit-bearing courses, something that, rather than bring a student in who's already at risk, already kind of barely hanging on to post-secondary education in the first place, but who wants to do something with their life, and then tell that student, that's great, we're here to support you, and after a year of remedial courses, then we can talk about you taking the courses that you really want to take and starting to work on what you're really here to learn. That integration of developmental education into the program makes a lot of sense for students where you do it. That, of course, is a complicated issue of how you do that, but it's clearly what serves the student best is to do that. We've also worked on reform of developmental math, and there's some interesting work. We're not the lead foundation. Hewlett and some other foundations have taken the lead, but we've been part of that to find better ways of doing math, remediation, developmental math. And that includes, the shift that from algebra-based models to more statistics-based models is a piece of that. And, all of these things enter into it. But there's another issue, which is, why do you need developmental ed in the first place? A college-ready student is a student who goes directly into credit-bearing courses and does not need remedial education or developmental education. So if that's the case, then the standard for college readiness is the cut score on the placement test for institutions. And so it's not the high school diploma, it's not even the high stakes assessment at the 11th or 12th grade level in the state system. It's not ACT or SAT scores. It's not GPA, it's none of those things. It's Compass or whatever, Accuplacer, or whatever people are using as their placement test. And is that aligned with high school curriculum? Is it aligned with college curriculum? Is it aligned with anything? Does anybody know what it's measuring, what it represents? These are good tests. I'm not critical. In fact, they're very good tests. They're very, very well designed tests. But that's the actual standard. And we know, for a fact, all of us know, the consequences for individual students of being on one side or the other of that cut score are extremely serious. We also know that it's somewhat arbitrary. We know that a student that's 1 point above the cut score has a very, very different educational experience than a student who's 1 point below the cut score, in terms of their likelihood of completing a program of studies, in terms of their likelihood of progressing to the sophomore year. All of these things are greatly determined by where they fall on that cut score. So the question I think we should be asking is, how do we align all of this stuff so that the assessment that the students are taking in the 11th grade, let's say, is aligned with the actual placement exams that the student, that are going to be used for determining whether the student is ready to go into credit-bearing courses. Higher education needs to be involved with the K-12 system in figuring that out. And that has to be done at a state or local level to make that make sense. How do you do that? Part of the answer is you use the Common Core work to do that. You use the systems that people are working on to try to understand and line up these, redefine what the learning outcomes of the K-12 system need to be. But rather than have that as a separate little exercise going on over here, having to do with something called the high school diploma, which we know for a fact is of limited utility in today's world. That all should be lined up with college readiness and the likelihood of college success, which is what we're really talking about in terms of developmental education. So that's another area of work for us, is to really figure out how to make this system work in a much more seamless fashion. It's part of what I was referring to when I talked about creating better pathways for students, so that what the expectations really are much clearer, much more transparent. And by the way, when students are ready to progress, they can progress. Why is it that when a student in the 11th grade demonstrates that they're college ready, that they don't start taking college level courses? And we kind of do that. We do a lot of this now. We do an advanced placement and dual enrollment and stuff like that. But we do it kind of on the side. We kind of, it's not readily available to a lot of students. Low income students of color are have less access to those programs. Why don't we think about that? Why don't we figure out a way to make that the norm rather than the exception? And likewise, if a student in the 11th grade, based on that assessment, why don't we understand where that student is in terms of college readiness? And if they are not college ready, do the remediation then and there. Why do we wait until they're 19 years old to show up on the college doorstep? That's a complicated question. It's a very good question. It's a very complicated question, because what's happened is we've built a system that is reliant on federal funding for student aid to make it possible for students to afford to participate in higher education. And that system is, again, one of these systems that is built around time. And so the whole issue is, how much time are you willing to pay? And a student with developmental education needs more time than a student that doesn't have the needs. A part-time student needs more time than a full-time student. And so when you're trying to allocate these scarce resources in the most effective fashion, how do you make sure that you allocate it in a way that the students with the greatest need actually have the support that they need to be successful? And yet not just simply allow students to, get federal aid and so forth indefinitely, because A, we can't afford that, and B, that doesn't serve the students' interests either. So it's a very complicated issue. Part of the answer, we believe, is that we need to use aid to incentivize both students and institutions to do the things that we know lead to student success. So that means it's not the same as giving the money to the students that are likely to succeed. That's not the same thing. It's giving money to students in a way that they are more likely, they will do the things that are more likely to lead to success. What are those things? It is things like getting in a clear program of studies early on. Don't spend 2 years, exploring the course catalog in a community college and then deciding, oh, okay, I think I'm ready to do this. You've got, if you should come in, particularly if you have financial need and you're focused on trying to get something that you can use and improve your life, come in, make some choices, get good advising, get on a program of studies and move through. And the progression through that program of studies becomes important, as opposed to simply accumulating a number of credits, which is what we do now. So that's an example. Likewise, the institutional eligibility for aid also needs to be based as well, at least in part, on institutions doing the right thing by their students. to provide those pathways, to provide those kinds of support services that will help the student be successful, to getting the students through. Not all institutions are created equal. You know, some institutions have very low rates of student success, and some of that is not dependent upon the student. And so we have to figure out a way to make sure that the institutions that are doing the right thing by students and helping students to be successful also get the support that they need. That's something the president talked about in the State of the Union. He didn't talk about how to do it, but he said, you know, that that ought to be a criteria applied to the eligibility for institutions to participate in federal aid programs. Right now, the criteria all have to do with sort of, you know, financial things and regulatory things. None of them have anything to do with how well the institution is in fact serving students.
Can I go back to 5 for a second?
Absolutely.
You know, and this comes from achieving the dream as well. You know, when you talk about leadership in terms of lobbying policymakers to promote access and completion of education for their community. I wouldn't discount that, but there's sort of this tension or the balance between you know, lobbying to change policy and asking presidents to take that on, and at the same time run an efficient and effective institution. It's not to say that it can't be done, but I think it's a delicate balance. And when we talk about policy and state policy, and certainly there are funding issues and those kinds of things, but is there a way into the policy piece that doesn't move or take presidents or other institutional leaders away from, and it's not a distraction from actually serving in that key leadership role, instructional leader that I mentioned a moment ago at the K-12 level. It's important for principals to be the instructional leaders of their cohort of teachers. I mean, not just the care and feeding of teachers and faculty, but to actually be the instructional leader. So there is this balance, and are there other ways, as in the Achieving the Dream, you know, you actually had this policy strand, and where it was sort of a collective approach to looking at policies and or regulations that would have an impact on student success at the institutional level. So are there ways of doing that, either through membership associations or the SHIELD in the state that would really address the issue? So why don't we see more articulation agreements between 2 and 4-year institutions? And how do we think about changing that in a sort of systemic, in a more systemic way? So I just wanted to say, I mean, there's this balance of, there are only 24 hours in a day, and so, you know, the expectations that chancellors, presidents would also be, you know, lead the charge on policy reform. In some places, in some situations, that's true. I can think of a number of presidents at community colleges around the country that are able to do that quite well. Conversely, I can think of, well, for others, it would be a distraction. The kinds of interventions, well, these interventions, be they learning communities, supplemental instruction, all of those programs. I'm underwhelmed that there really isn't a lot of new stuff. So gee, that's a lot of what I was doing right before transitioning. I was assistant vice chancellor for the Division of Academic Support at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And so we had mentoring programs, we had early warning systems, we had math labs, and all this stuff. And so I still see the same things. Now the technology may have been interjected, but basically, you know, a lot of the same models, learning communities, faculty. And for me, what seems to still be the critical factor is the extent to which students have relationships with faculty, particularly outside of the classroom. And many years ago, I mean, Mike Nettles and others pointed to, particularly for students of color, African American students in predominantly white institutions, that was one of the most critical variables, the extent to which they actually had built and established a relationship with faculty outside of the classroom. Well, my portfolio at Lilly Endowment included, in addition to the Indiana private colleges and universities, also because of the Lilly family legacy, private historically black colleges. And we extended that to public HBCUs as well. But, you know, this is, I don't have empirical evidence, but even at HBCUs, you know, that seems to be as important. Students, black African American students who do well at HBCUs, they seem to have made that connection with faculty, particularly if they're not the highest achieving students. That, you know, that relationship can be one of the factors. And I would even extend it to support staff as well. I mean, we had counselors in the academic support center. We had counselors in the multicultural center. We had, you know, working with the Black Student Union, all of the different groups. Having that connectedness on campus, you know, a person on campus. And I think you mentioned that a moment ago in some of at your campus. So that can be the difference between whether you leave or not. And so, you know, when I look at this, I don't know if there are. I suppose the innovation may come with the technology, but it's that kind of relationship, particularly for students who may be struggling academically, they may be struggling financially, they may be struggling with, you know, family relationships. And again, I don't mean to suggest that that's just for students of color, but certainly I think for students, I happen to be one of these persons that believe race still matters. In fact, I still think that one of the challenging conversations when we talk about the data and the Achieving the Dream initiative, again, it was very clear what Byron McClinney calls having courageous conversations at the departmental level when we talk about, so who's expected to succeed and who not, and the extent to which race and class plays a part in that, and whether it's consciously or subconsciously, or just the presence of institutional racism and the fact and the impact that can have. So,
which can be pretty covert.
Well, it tends to be very, very covert. Until it shows up, and so I don't know about the innovation, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle in terms of student success. Because, well, we have a black president now. Well, we have, you know, particularly in a down economy, tough economic times, there's a tendency to pull apart and not come together. So
yeah, we still have Trayvon Martin's too.
Yeah, and the anniversary came and went. I think that was last week, and as I say, sort of the beat goes on.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that I could take to my classmates to help us understand about Lumina and the work that you do, how it ties in? Any advice you give us, anything that you want to add?
Well, if you've looked at the 2013-16 strategic plan, we have carved out a huge challenge here. And by and large, so since the public launch several weeks ago, the feedback has been pretty remarkable, positive. In fact, I would refer you, the Center on Responsive Philanthropy did an article last month. It's a nice piece. You might, and your colleagues may want to take a look at it in terms of a foundation, and Lumina is commended for taking the approach that's being taken in the strategic plan, which is bless you. We had a lot of internal conversation about the use of the word advocacy. So, advocating for increased student success in higher education, or mobilizing metro areas, bless you.
Thank you.
Mobilizing higher ed, the mobilizing piece, that's one big bucket. The other three strategies, new models of student financial aid, the credentialing system that we talked about a little earlier. Those are huge issues.
It is not about higher education per se, it is about student success.
Our data also suggests that the return on a post-high school credential degree is greater now than it's ever been, and it's getting greater at a faster rate than it's ever gotten.
Yeah, I think community colleges play a critical role, not only in repackaging and delivering credentials that we know need to be developed and expanded to meet the goal, but also the fact that they're so localized. They represent the local response to education in our community, especially the workforce needs.
One of the things that emerged from achieving the dream that is unequivocal is leadership.
Now we got to get down and figure out what do we do and who's pulling what parts of this wagon.
Yeah, I think community colleges play a critical role.
I guess the last thing I say about what Lumina is about is it is about being a voice for the voiceless.
I would just encourage you and others to stay tuned, and also because we do look at unsolicited ideas, if you have a better way, a better mousetrap, we would love to hear from you about how to think about any of the issues around redesigning the system or mobilizing institutions.